Okay, as people are still signing on, I'm just going to welcome everyone. My name is Rabbi Shani Gross from the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies. Welcome to our Pre-Shavuot Yom Iyun Day of Learning. This is an event that is in partnership between Pardes and Ramah Darom. This was originally meant to be our annual in-person retreat at Ramah Darom for Shavuot, but we have since adapted. We have some amazing faculty that we're going to be learning from both institutions throughout the day. And we're going to begin with our panel on holy relationships in a time of social distance with our Pardes president, Rabbi Leon Morris, Rabbi Meir Schweiger, our longtime faculty at Pardes, Aviva Lauer Golbert, the director of Pardes Center for Jewish Educators, and Rabba Yaffa Epstein, the director of the Wexner Heritage Program, as well as longtime faculty at Pardes. And I'm going to, without further ado, pass it off to our fearless moderator and partner, Eliana Leader, the director of the Kaplan Mitchell Retreat Center at Ramah Darom, and she's going to tell us how this is all going to work.
Thank you so much, Shani. Welcome everyone to what is our third annual Pardes Beit Midrash B'Darom. But what is interesting is every year we have seen it have a slightly different iteration. And so now we've been able to open up this experience, if I can think of it with any kind of silver lining. We've been able to open it up to even more people than may have been able to join us in the mountains for us to talk about our experience together receiving the Torah at the mountains. So without further ado, I want to first and foremost thank everybody who had to do some significant pivoting to take this from an in-person relational-based experience together and bring it online. And it is interesting and apropos to talk about holy relationships in this time of social distancing. First and foremost, even though we are distant, I want to thank the partners at Pardes, particularly Shani and the team who has worked tirelessly to be able to make this program happen, as well as my coworkers at Ramah Darom, who have also done some significant pivoting on making sure that this experience was still meaningful and a great opportunity to get us in the right mind frame to get ready for Shavuot. So thank you, all of you. So what are holy relationships? There are a lot of ways that we would be able to define this for ourselves, but today we're really thinking about holy relationships in some particular ways. First, our relationship to ourselves and God, divine, creator, however you think of that for yourself. Our relationship between ourselves and ourselves. And so the spiritual identity that we get through that, our self to community and our self to family. So where do we see holiness throughout all of these relationships? And how do we connect with them during this time of social distancing? So I want to, how we will work this is I'm going to be asking some questions and picking those on the panel to be able to answer. We'll be able to have a little bit of back and forth. And then towards the end, we are going to open it up and ask you to send in your questions through the Zoom group chat. So as you are on there and you are thinking of some burning questions, please send those over and we will spend some time answering them towards the end. So I want to jump right in, and I'm going to direct this question first to Rabbi Leon. In thinking about the way Judaism is designed, right? We have all of these different types of ways to manifest our spiritual identity, but is it particularly designed to feel divine inspiration via communal relationships? Is there space for all of them, or is it really this design of community that we rely on to think about holy relationships?
Thanks, Eliana. I just want to say it's great to be with all of you, and we really value and have valued this partnership between the Pardes Institute and Ramah Darom. So thank you for making this pivot possible. For me, one of the main ways that I experience God's presence is in relationship to the other And the other is usually an individual. It's a friend, a stranger, someone who's in need, someone who is the recipient of an act of kindness, my wife, my children. And many of us are familiar with the theology of that kind of discovery of God's presence in the midst of that relationship, expressed most fully and most eloquently by Martin Buber, the I-thou relationship. My own teacher, Eugene Borowitz, Zichrono Livracha, framed Buber's approach as saying, in true meeting, we may sense an other who stands behind the dialogue partners and makes it possible for them to meet one another. So God is the presence that makes that meeting possible. That speaks to one-on-one relationships. The other person who's created in God's image, seeing the other person as an icon of God, to borrow from the work of Yair Leuberbaum. And I access God easily, God's presence, or more easily in that sort of way. To feel God's presence in the community and to see the whole community or a whole group of people as the other is a bit more challenging for all of the obvious reasons, all of the social dynamics and the issues that we have with other people and the degree of self-consciousness and not being sure whether this community is really my community. That's a real challenge, and I want to speak to that for a moment. There's a beautiful Agadah from Masechet Brachot, which imagines God not in search of a person, but rather in search of a community of people. Rabbi Yochanan says, whenever the Holy One comes into a synagogue and doesn't find a minyan, doesn't find 10, God instantly becomes angry. And then the Agadah quotes Yeshayahu, Isaiah, who says, Madua bati ve'ein ish, karati ve'ein oneh. When I came, there wasn't any person there. And when I called out, there was no answer. And that's what God feels like, according to this Agadah, when there isn't a community. God's loneliness is assuaged in this Agadah, not by the individual, but by a community, a minyan. And the primacy of a minyan, of a quorum, of having 10 Jews, is not just a technicality of halacha. It's an assertion that our holiest words that we can possibly utter, Devarim Shebekadusha, can only be spoken in the presence of a community that recites them together. And that is a really important theological notion, and it's one that I think that's countercultural and even, I would say for myself, counterintuitive, that the community supersedes the individual, that community obligation is more important than individual autonomy. And this setup mirrors what the Beit HaMikdash, what the ancient temple was like as well. It was a public domain. My colleague and teacher, Mark Wachowski, makes this point in his book, Jewish Living, that daily Shabbat and festival offerings in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, were performed in the name of all of Israel. So the Jewish connection to God was not a collection of individuals, but as Israel, as a single and unique people. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz talks about the minyan as a microcosm of Knesset Yisrael, of the entirety of the Jewish people in relationship to God. And this is really challenging for us. It's challenging for me. I recognize it intellectually, but given how many dynamics are in play in the real communities of which I'm a part, it's extremely challenging to see in the communal experience that kind of spiritual feeling, to be aware that I'm part of a microcosm of Knesset Yisrael. I have felt it at times. I felt it in settings where there's a very consistent and pervasive notion that what we're doing is more than just studying together, or it's more than just praying together, that there's a real shared mission and a vision for the world, and that we're all aspiring to be more, that there's a culture of embrace and respect and love that permeates. In those kinds of rare environments, I feel that. I felt it as a student at Pardes in the Beit Midrash 25 years ago. I feel it frequently at my family's Kehillah, our congregation, Kehilat Zion in Jerusalem. But it is so much more challenging than finding God's presence in the connection between me and one other person.
Thank you so much. It's interesting because it brings up kind of how a lot of us rely on not just minyan, but also these venues, these very specific community-based venues to engage that divine inspiration, and rightfully so, right? That's the way that we've been designed, to your point. But as these kind of holy communal venues are places that we have less access to, and I'm going to start with you as a follow-up, Rabbi Leon, but I'm going to open it up to everyone, to all of our panelists. I also do want to make mention, I apologize, I can't see all of our panelists all at the same time on my screen. So I won't be able to just call on you if you're ready to speak. So if you will just jump in as needed to be able to answer the question, I would appreciate it. But I will start with you, Rabbi Leon, asking you on a personal note, right? Like what, so that we can learn from your experiences as well, what kind of struggles are coming up for you in not being able to access those holy communal venues, and how are you addressing them? How are you thinking through those holy relationships when you have to separate yourself from those community-based venues?
I'll just say briefly that as things have loosened up here in Israel, and it's been possible for the last 3 Shabbatot to pray with other people, I suddenly had like a newfound appreciation for how amazing that is, even though it's, we're 2 meters apart and we're wearing face masks. And I remember 3 Shabbatot ago, it was just like this incredible thing. I came home and told my family, I davened with real people again, sort of face to face. So I think something that I would have taken for granted, coming to recognize what a special gift that is. This past Shabbat, a bar mitzvah, we were allowed 50 people, a bar mitzvah of our neighbors in the street outside of our apartment. Again, the magic of community that maybe I didn't fully appreciate.
Interesting. Anybody else? I actually am interested, Yaffa, since you're in the US, and things have not switched over as openly as they have in Israel. Could you perhaps speak to this same answer around replacing these communal venues for yourself and the struggle that might come up in maintaining these holy relationships?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's interesting. I will say it's true. It's actually an interesting moment where different parts of the world are opening differently, and even in America, different parts of America are opening differently, and how that's affecting people's experiences. There was a real sense, I would say, of us, we're all sort of in this together. I think it's extremely challenging to do Judaism in isolation. And I don't think I would have really understood that without this experience, and the critical nature of community as we navigate. I do think it's an interesting question about Beit Knesset versus Beit Midrash, and learning Torah versus Tefillah, and also smachot, as Leon brought up, what does it mean to have a simcha? I've been to many smachot over Zoom, and also many, sadly, Zoom shivas, and sort of sad ritual moments and life cycle moments. And so, it's an interesting thing, because there is a way in which this forum actually does lend itself to connection, and there is a way in which it's just not the same. And I'm extremely curious for where this is going to take us in the future. this I'll just put a little tiny teaser. There's also a question here about, denominational issues and how that is going to affect us. I just really think it's important to bring that up, that not everyone, not every community is making the same choices. And particularly for Shavuot, which we'll talk about later, I'm sort of curious how that's gonna manifest and what that means for us as a community to be going through certain parts of this similarly and to be going through other parts of it very differently, and how that accentuates our differences or our similarities. So I just want to put that out there also.
I think it's a great point. What's interesting, I'm kind of a rare unicorn in the aged millennials, where I'm a member of multiple synagogues and multiple denominations, and the way that thinking about how people are replacing these communal venues together and moving online, or trying to think about distancing ways to pass each other by if it's nearby, has actually been it's been interesting to see some of the ways in which the responses have been the same, and then some of the ways in which they've been different. And I'm interested to hear if others would like to post in the chat. We can get from the participants thoughts on some struggles that you've been having on not having access to your communal venues, whether it's the Beit Knesset, whether it's the Beit Midrash, whether there are other spaces like schools that you're thinking of as your communal venues, the struggle that's been coming up for you in maintaining these relationships and how you're addressing them as we're answering. And I'm going to turn to Aviva and ask, what do you think people need when we're thinking about all the responses that these institutions and these organizations are trying to think of? What do you think people need from their spiritual communities at this time? What do you think institutions could be doing to serve these holy relationships when we are more distant physically than we are used to?
So thanks, Eliana. I actually was hoping to, I think I was going to be the minority opinion here. I wanted to share, piggyback a little bit on what Leon and Yaffa were saying, and share my personal experience with the dissonance between the holy relationship that I'm able to sort of cultivate now with the divine differently than usual, and the lack of communal relationship that I'm able to have at this point. And I do think that maybe, I wonder if I'm going to get booed here. For me, I'm somewhat of, it might not seem like this to those who know me, but I'm somewhat of an introvert, and being able to be home by myself has been comforting in a lot of ways. It's been, I guess, because it's been very, very scary. It's scary for me for everyone to go outside. So to be able to be in my holy of holies, which is, my living room, which feels safe and healthy for me as opposed to outside, I have really felt like I could commune with God in a certain sense. And, I'm not somebody who prays the matbeah, the regular tefillah 3 times a day. I talk to God all the time. And so I've really been relishing this type of being able to be with God. And I had this experience a couple of times, actually, Mincha and Mariv time. Outside my window, the people on Primo Levi Street were putting together an outdoor minyan. First, it was on their mirpeset, on their balcony, but then actually it was downstairs. And I, one Friday night, decided I really do want to pray Kabbalat Shabbat with the language of Kabbalat Shabbat. And I sat down on my living room couch with my Siddur, and I wanted to sing aloud a little bit, and I wanted to just say words at my pace. And suddenly there's this very, very loud minyan outside imposing on me. I felt, I'm trying to be with God right now, and you all are singing with your own nusach really, really loudly. And I felt at that moment really like, wait a minute, I'm in the Holy of Holies right now. I'm in my Beit Knesset. What are you doing? And then, I realized, wait a second. that might be my experience at this moment, but these 10 people outside, they're having their experience, and I have to respect that too. But it's this very strange dissonance that we're going through of what we're able to do, what we want to do. And I think afterward, whatever the afterward is going to be, the question of what is it that we want, what really speaks to us and fulfills us, the answer might be very different for different people. I didn't answer your question at all, Eliana.
You know what? That's okay. And we will get back to that question later. But because we're already on this topic, I then want to pivot and ask you to actually expound upon it a little bit, because I'm feeling incredibly inspired by your response. And I'm curious if you would share with us, because it sounds like this has been a really powerful experience for you. You know, how has your own holy voice come to the forefront or gotten louder during this time of isolation? If we think about the holy relationship to the self, right? We started by talking about holy relationship via community. But if you can think of this as a rare opportunity to really dig deep and make that relationship to self grow and be louder, for you personally, or people that you have heard from, how has this actually been a time to nurture that relationship and strengthen that voice? Can you tell us more?
Sure. I think there is something very, very strange about Zoom, in that, you know, when you're speaking to people in regular life, you don't see yourself. You know, when you're teaching a class, generally in regular life, you don't see yourself. And here on Zoom, my life is on Zoom now, like everybody else's. You know, I spend hours and hours a day on Zoom, talking to students, talking to colleagues. And this question of what is my true voice coming out now? Is my true voice that voice that I'm trying to reflect back at myself, because I see myself and I see everyone seeing me? Is my true voice the one of courage, which is the one that I really, really have tried to share with my students? But Zoom has also allowed the situation where I have been in communal situations with students and with other, with the Pardes community a lot, especially. And I know that they see me, really see me. And they'll say, you know, they'll write me in the chat, what's going on? Are you okay? Are you handling things? And even though I'm trying so hard to be the brave one, you know, to be the mom, in a sense, to my students, even though, you know, generally they have their own mom, right? I'm trying to be that strong voice, but the truth of my smallness, the truth of my fear comes out at this time. So maybe both of those are true. My real voice, you know, the voice of myself and my connection to the divine come out both in my attempt and in my failure at that attempt to be strong at that moment with them.
Wow, that's really powerful. It's bringing up for me, thinking about some of that independent voice and that balance. I'm seeing in the chat a lot of people talking about the relationship to self getting louder just by virtue of being isolated, not just because they're in their homes, but also because they're in a town or a city or a state that actually might not have that same kind of density of Jewish community, and thereby relying on yourself a little more than you would have otherwise, even in things like a mirpeset minyan, where that's not necessarily available to you, and needing to really push to develop that relationship to self. I want to actually turn to Yaffa and ask this question, because Yaffa, I know that you have made a recent move from New York to Columbus, Ohio, where you may have had the opportunity to do that mirpeset minyan in the past, and you're switching over to what might be an experience for others who are listening to this panel right now, in thinking about holidays, right, where there had been this critical mass of community perhaps in a place like New York, where you're then shifting over to having holidays in a place that maybe a little more spread out in terms of community, and it forces more of a reliance of that holy relationship to manifest inside of the home, instead of thinking of creative ways of having that those, the cheers and the calls from one porch to another. And I'm curious, in your navigating of going from kind of such dense community and shifting over to thinking about these holidays that you've been experiencing in your new town, how has some of that space to think about holy moments or spiritual moments like holidays, or like holiday of Shavuot coming up, or Pesach that we just had. Some people may have had Purim alone, others may have still been out, but I'm curious, maybe how has some of that shift also manifested being in a place where you're a little more reliant on creating these spiritual experiences for yourself in the home, instead of relying on that more populous community?
Okay, thank you so much, Eliana. I actually haven't had a chance yet to even say thank you for being here. So I just want to say that there's so many beautiful faces and names as we're scrolling across, and it's great to be here. So I just wanted to say that first of all. Actually, Eliana, and I'm sorry that you didn't know this before the panel, but I've actually been in New York for all of this experience.
Oh, interesting.
I'm so sorry, team.
Interesting.
And, I'm sorry to put a kibosh on that particular.
Talk to us.
I'll talk about the question in general.
Yeah,
I'm sorry about that. And also I want to just say that actually Bexley, Ohio, I know there's a couple people from Ohio, from Bexley on this call. I just want to say that it's actually a pretty dense Jewish community. And my building, I would argue that my building in Columbus is actually the same percentage probably of Jews as my building here in New York. So that's actually an interesting conversation for another day. But just to defend Bexley a little bit. It's actually interesting. I was thinking about the difference between Yerushalayim, like Aviva's Mirpeset, and actually we don't have that in New York. Weirdly, you'd think it would, like, there'd be minyanim in the buildings, but there actually is not at this point, which I actually think is kind of weird. Some buildings I know open their doors for Marish Tana or other parts of the Seder, but my building did not do that. And I think part of what, Eliana, I think you're like sort of touching on in my particular case is that I have been in lockdown, or whatever we're calling this, stay-at-home measures, alone, and I've had Chagim and Shabbatot basically alone. So, and particularly, I wrote this post on Facebook about doing Seder alone. And it's interesting because in general, why not, this is on Facebook Live, why not be totally out there? But in general, I don't usually talk about that aspect of my life. I'm pretty private about it. And there's something about this time where even the privacy of our own homes is actually public, right? Like some people love it. That's so intimate. We can see into each other's offices and homes and living rooms, and, oh, that's an interesting art choice. And, you're getting a sense of people, and there's very little boundaries actually, although you can see that I physically put a boundary that's important to me. So, but there's something about this time that is boundaryless. But it was an interesting move on my part. I'll just share that, it was very important to me to say out loud, very publicly, I am about to walk into doing Pesach Seder for the first time in my life, completely alone. And thousands of people had that experience. And I do want to just sidebar and say that many, and Leon said this to me at the beginning of this call, and I think it's actually very important to identify and to say out loud that many people spent Passover and the Pesach Seder this year completely differently than they would have. And that was difficult and challenging and important to say that. And people were away from their grandchildren, which is extremely painful. And grandchildren were away from their grandparents and away from their parents. And people were, it was a very hard time. And everyone I know talked about how it was different. So I just want to say that, which, by the way, I think was amazing because it gave people a completely different opportunity to have things open that I really, I know it's a terrible time. Don't get me wrong. But there's also been, for me personally, amazing things that have happened in this time. One of which was having Seder by myself. And I will say this, which is unbelievable. It was actually amazing Sorry, Imanaba, if you're watching this, but it was actually totally amazing to be completely alone for Seder. And I surrounded myself with Haggadot of my friends that my friends and teachers have written. And a dear friend of mine compiled like all these messages from my family and from my teachers. And it was an amazing way. I really can't believe this. Like, it sounds ridiculous. As I'm saying, I'm like, this is so Pollyannish, but it actually was miraculous to think about the voices that I wanted to bring into my experience. And I'm going to say this also, and this really is a tribute to my family, to hear all of those voices, my father singing was with me as I sang. It was really unbelievable to me. Like, it was actually unbelievable to experience when there is silence, there is suddenly room for other voices that you didn't know you were carrying to have voice. And it was one of the most profound spiritual experiences, I would say, of my life. I sang very loud, which I don't usually get to do because I have a terrible voice. So I also got to sing out and to bring all of those voices of the past and of my loved ones and of my teachers into my space. It was really quite miraculous, I would say.
Well, and it sounds to me like we have a lot to learn, whether we are having these experiences solo because we are physically in a space solo, or I will reaffirm that not everyone is in as dense a community as Bexley, and so to make that sometimes feel a little bit isolated, it sounds like that can actually bring a lot of beauty and a lot of opportunity, right? I think it's hard to talk about opportunity as we see a lot of challenges, especially not wanting to belittle any of the challenges that others might be experiencing that we might not. And there's a spiritual responsibility, right, that we have towards every person, whether they are in our home or outside of our homes, that we still have this responsibility towards. And Rav Meir, it's interesting. This is an interesting time to be having you on this panel, and also to be having this conversation with you as you yourself are also transitioning from being this very full-time educator to starting to step away from Pardes. And I know that I can speak for all of us how much we will miss you, and the blessings of all of your current online podcasts and the like, to be able to get some last Torah together. And so I'm curious to hear from you around this idea of spiritual responsibility towards other people, as you have dedicated your life to thinking about that cause. In what ways, could you answer for us, in what ways do you think we're seeing this spiritual responsibility towards others more acutely now? How might this be something that we're carrying with us beyond this moment, right? Whether it's transitioning to being a teacher full-time and switching what we've been doing every single day, or going from being very heavily communally based to being a little more independent or isolated. How do we focus on that spiritual responsibility towards others, even when they might not be with us in this moment?
Thank you very much, Eliana, and I am very happy that we're able to do this online. Originally, we were supposed to be together in person, but at least this is the next best thing that we can do. I have to say that, first of all, I'd just like to start out by saying that actually this whole period of the coronavirus has actually been a very positive period for me. I mean, I know for many people it's been very traumatic, but for me, it's actually been a wonderful experience. The only thing which has been extremely difficult for me has been the fact that I have not had contact with my grandchildren, or minimal contact with my grandchildren. And that's been a very, very difficult experience. But on a personal level, I think it was, there were a lot of very positive things. And I also want to make a certain distinction in terms of what people were speaking about between the spiritual experience of davening versus the spiritual experience of learning. In other words, on the one hand, I actually found it very positive for me to be able to daven by myself. As Leon and Aviva said, very often I have trouble davening in a minyan because it's not giving me the space for my personal experience. In fact, most of the time I usually actually daven at my own pace beforehand and then somehow plug into the minyan. So this was actually a wonderful opportunity to be able to daven by myself in my own space. But there was a flip side to this, which is in the context of learning. And this is something which I've thought about for a very long time, and now I finally had the opportunity, and that was online learning. And what I found, which was fascinating, with a number of online shiurim that were available, and also the tremendous thirst that people had for learning. So that kind of ironically, what I find is that I am actually reaching many more people now online than I would be had I been doing my regular teaching. So I just want for the record, since Leon, I think, also posted it, even though I'm retiring from being full-time faculty at Pardes, essentially that just means I won't be in the building of Pardes, but I'm not stopping to teach. In fact, I see this as being an opportunity for actually reaching a much wider audience. In fact, I've even been reinforced in terms of the last 2 months that it's unbelievable how you can reach people across the world, and especially what a number of people brought up, for those people who are in distant, isolated Jewish communities. I think, if anything, this has actually enabled them to be in many ways more connected, because this way they have the opportunity to actually learn, and this is actually much better than podcasts, because you actually get to see the people that you're learning with, to actually be able to engage them. I actually found also that through learning, which for me was a very powerful experience, that it actually enabled me to reconnect with many people who I really care about, our alumni, okay, and the general public who I, during the regular course of events, I'm too busy to actually speak to them. And now here we have an opportunity to not only engage in learning, but actually to talk to each other. So I found that kind of ironically, the corona has actually, as Yaffa said, kind of, broken down the boundaries, but in this case, the geographical boundaries, and it actually enables us to connect in a much deeper way than we would have otherwise. So I am actually very excited about the possibilities that this opens up. And I think that this actually shows that it is possible for people to be connected, okay, even though they seem to be very far away, but actually we're very close. And I think it also enables us to bring a whole variety of people together. I would also say it was very interesting that because of this breakdown in boundaries, that there's always the issue when it comes to davening in Pardes about the different types of minyanim. So now, because of doing it online, we actually had Mechitza and Igal and whoever else wanted to participate all together in a Zoom Hallel, so that everybody was actually was able to sing and to really rejoice on Rosh Chodesh. So I see there being actually very, very positive elements, and I certainly see that these are elements that we can and should take with us in the future. And I think these are things that could, so when we talk especially about Shavuot coming together, I think Zoom can actually become an unbelievable way of getting people, and even if we don't do it on Shavuot night, but even if we do it in preparation of Shavuot, we can actually bring and get a much greater sense of a community through Zoom.
I love that, and it's interesting because it sounds way more rather than a retirement, rather than a pivot of ways in which you will continue to be able to engage and serve people and teach. And I'm curious because I want to go back to this question that we had thought about at the beginning about ways in which spiritual communities and our institutions might be able to serve us at this time. Places like Pardes and Ramah, oftentimes people think of it as a very location-based experience for themselves, and how perhaps in the roles that you're transitioning to with Pardes, or thinking, giving me advice as we think about how Ramah Darom can continue to serve, and other institutions that that oftentimes people thought of as gathering spaces, and those communal spaces were about presence. How might we think about being able to serve people with the same essence of a desire to connect to one another? How can we take, how are we as those who work for institutions responsible for thinking about the spiritual needs of our participants, and how, just to your point of being able, perhaps, I thought a perfect example was the different minyanim who can now come together. How might other innovations be swirling in your mind about ways that we can rethink this paradigm and we can serve the relationships and the holiness of what we bring to the table for people?
I mean, I think there are no limits to this. I think there's a tremendous amount that can be done. I also just want to add one caveat, which I think is really important. When push comes to shove, I still don't think this is going to be a substitute for in-person, right, get-togethers. I think that's clear that, in other words, ultimately, right, we need to be seeing each other one-on-one or with a group in person. I think there's nothing that can, be a substitute for that. But on the other hand, the fact that we are able to actually come into people's spaces, okay, if they're unable to come to us, that we can now come to them, I think that can be done in many different ways. I think it can be done in terms of learning. I think it can be done in terms of, singing. It can be done in terms of, services in different ways. Okay, even if you had, right, a pre-Kabbalat Shabbat, which, by the way, we had in our neighborhood. That, in other words, there were a few people who would actually go on Zoom before Shabbat and then do a musical pre-Kabbalat Shabbat as a way of somehow bringing people together, getting them into the spirit of Shabbat. And then afterwards, even if everybody would end up doing Kabbalat Shabbat on their own, but it's as if they've already gotten into that mood before Shabbat. And I think that there are, as I said, many, many ways, and each organization, each group has their particular strengths. And, there are things that I've seen that have been done with kids, and things that are done with, young adults, and things that are done with older people. And each group, I think, has to see what is it that they can do. And you can even do it in, mini, how should I put it, spurts. But I've actually started to think about this, okay? I'll talk with Leon about it and anybody else who's interested, but I have a lot of ideas, and I actually find this as being, as you said, a very exciting transition, because I think it really has the opportunity to have a very large impact. So Eliana, I think it's exciting. We can do it, and I think, but as I said, with all that we do on Zoom, that's not a substitute in the end for the actual in-person relationships. And I think it's important for people to realize that. And I would hope that with all the learning that we do, that, and I say this to everyone, that should be the springboard to eventually have us come all together in the same place, that we can actually have that I-thou encounter.
It's interesting that you say so, because you have set me up perfectly in pivoting to think about ourselves in this particular space of the ways in which we need to pivot and we need to think, but also our essence is around this communal gathering. And I'm going to turn my question over to Rav Leon as we start to think about how we take this entire concept and theme and apply it to Shavuot as we start to prepare for it. The essence of Shavuot, it's a celebration of what our texts portray as a very intense communal gathering, and an intense communal experience where we were together at Har Sinai to accept the Torah. And our tradition tells us that we're meant to imagine ourselves as if we ourselves were there. But at this moment in time, we literally could not have gathered at Har Sinai even if we wanted to, right? And I want to turn to Rav Leon and ask, where should we be pivoting our focus here for Shavuot? What kind of guidance could we receive to think about this intensely communal experience, and not replacing the desire to think of it as a communal experience and still connect to it, but reflect on it perhaps in a different way, and restructure it as we go into this holiday and into our learning, where we're focusing on the communal, but it might be a more independent experience. If you can
Sure, thanks, Eliana. I think that Shavuot and the idea of Ma'amad Har Sinai, of standing at Mount Sinai, is an interplay between a communal experience and an individual experience. Each person, we all stood at Sinai together, but each Jew experienced God's revelation in different ways. We have that famous midrash from Pesikta de Rav Kahana that at Sinai, God appeared to the people of Israel like a statue that has faces on all sides, so that every person seeing it would say, the divine voice is speaking to me. And so this is that interplay. We're having this communal experience, but it's also very personal. Midrash Tanhuma says that Torah could only be given to those who ate man, to those who had experienced or would experience eating manna in the desert. And we learn through numerous midrashim that manna tasted different to each person and each category of person that ate it, that to babies it tasted like mother's milk, and to the elderly it tasted like wafers, and to others it tasted like honey. So there is something both communal and very personal, very individual. And this year we'll be celebrating, a lot of people will be celebrating Shavuot by themselves. And maybe it's an opportunity to know that, well, what we're sharing is a calendar and various spiritual practices that mark this day and that remind us that we're part of a larger group, we're part of a larger nation, but that this might be a Shavuot where we try to recapture and savor the different ways in which we hear Torah, the different ways in which we hear God's voice, the different ways that the Torah tastes, depending on the category that we're in.
I love that. And a quick plug for my own class later. I will be digging into that idea about the collective experience, but our own independent ways of connecting to it. I'd like to ask, this is going to go to every single person on the panel here, so get ready, because we need some advice on what we are going to go into, as we have the opportunity, many of us, to be able to do some independent learning over this Shavuot. We might not have a tikkun leil that we have access to, and we will be relying upon either print out, Sefaria, or our texts that we have at home to be able to think about what we want to learn over Shavuot. So if I can turn, and I will call on each of you, but if you could give us guidance on perhaps maybe some recommended texts to select to learn for Shavuot during this time, if we are going to be learning on our own independently and we are creating our own classes, what would you recommend that we dig into? And Rabbi Leon, since you already had the floor, I'm going to turn back to you and ask you first.
Well, I just threw out some beautiful midrashim that I think are worth rediscovering. So I'll just throw out a modern text that kind of also amplifies this notion of hearing Torah in so many different ways as multivocal, and really embracing the rabbi's position as kind of proto-postmoderns. This is a book by a teacher of mine, Mark Ellen Waknin. I'll put the name and the book in the chat. The Burnt Book, Reading the Talmud. And it really is about the way in which the fact that the reader can ascribe meaning to a text is what makes a text great. And I think in this Shavuot, when a lot of us are rediscovering Torah anew by ourselves, there might be something very empowering in this.
Thank you. Yes, if you can place that in the text, that would be excellent. And Rav Meir, I'd like to ask you the same question, and if you can also text yours in the chat when you're done. Sure. Rav Meir, I'm asking if you'd be able to share a recommendation on some text.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was muted.
I was giving you time.
I just want to say personally, I usually have a problem with Tikkun Leil Shavuot. And my problem is that that there are a lot of classes which are being given, but generally there isn't individual study. And my feeling is that actually Shavuot should be a time when people take the things that are closest to their heart and really have an opportunity to learn them in much more depth. So for example, for me, I mean, I do Daf Yomi. So Tikkun Leil Shavuot is a great time to do a few pages of Gemara, or I do also certain things in Tanakh. So my personal suggestion would be for everyone to find what is it, those areas that they particularly like, or even classes which they've heard, and then have a way of then taking those texts and reviewing them on Shavuot night, and then trying to go deeper into them, perhaps with some guidance that might be, other things that they can be looking at. But when we talk about the idea of, people having, hearing the Torah in different voices, so I'm a big believer of that, and that people should actually be studying the Torah, which is the closest to them and which they feel the most connected to. And I think a lot of times people may go to classes which might be interesting, but don't necessarily really speak to their needs. So it might be a good opportunity for people to think, what is it that they really like? And then to focus on that on Leil Shavuot.
Thank you. I love that perspective. If Rav Yaffa, if I could have you answer the same.
Sure. So I just want to point out that not everyone is going to be having the same experience on, there are many synagogues and many communities that are still having Tikkun Leil on Zoom on Shavuot night. So I just want to put that out there. And it's actually an interesting thing. I'll just share a worry that I have about that, which is, one of the things I've always loved so much about Tikkun Leil in Yerushalayim, in New York, where I've experienced it, or at Darom, Ramah Darom, is the power for Torah to be something that overcomes our denominational boundaries. And I'm actually kind of worried. I'm just sharing this. I can say the controversial things now because I'm worried. But I'm actually worried about the Shavuot being divisive in this way. So that's something I'm just feeling a lot of worry about, actually, about with this. For me, Shavuot night used to be a time like we're all learning Torah across denominations, across beliefs and ages, and there's a way in which I'm actually worried that we're not gonna have that experience this year, and it's gonna feel isolating. So I just want to charge us all, if I may, that this year will be different, but next year, please God, we'll all be able to cross-denominationally learn together once again. And I'll put a plug in also for many people are doing tikkuns, cross-denominational and pluralistic tikkuns from now, like this one, until Shavuot. So like to take advantage of all of those moments also where we can still be one community and build bridges and which is what Pardes is all about. And so that's just my fear and my desire for us to stay one and to let Torah be the thing that bonds us. And in terms of learning, I would say this, like print out as many, for those people who are going to be doing Tikkun Leil alone, or whether that means with your family or a small group or just yourself, to just print out as many different kinds of learning as possible. That's really my, and sometimes you're gonna feel like learning 4 pages of Gemara in a row, and sometimes you're gonna feel like I just need something sweet and light. And not that Gemara can't be sweet and light, don't get me wrong. And I know that Pardes has materials, and I know that many other institutions, we mentioned Sefaria, I just wanna say, my dear friend and Chavruta, who I met at Pardes, Rabbanit Sarah Walkenfeld is their Chief Learning Officer, has put together an amazing thing called Sinai at Home. So I want to just give a plug for that. Like it's annotated source sheets, not just source sheets, but sort of how to learn them. I'll put a plug in for that. And just as my teacher, Rabbi Meir said, find what your heart loves and learn that, and also make room for lots of different kinds of loves over the 2 days. You don't have to learn it at night. You can learn at any point over Shavuot or during the week or during the year. Torah is always there for you.
Amen. Yeah, and what's interesting about the plug for Sefaria is a perfect example, I think, that is indicative of this experience where we work together, right? Where Ramah Darom and Pardes are working together. The strength of our Torah and our texts and the strength of our community is the ways in which we hold each other up and we support each other. So for those who might also have other resources that you're thinking of, other websites that you would recommend that people can dig into as we get our resources together for Shavuot, please include them in the chat. We would love to hear about them. Aviva, I'm going to put you to ask you for the final recommendation on text, and I'm going to ask for a quick twist for those who are educators here in this call. What would you perhaps recommend that as they're digging into texts, this might be an opportunity to do some self-learning and re-inspire yourself to be able to jump back in there for your students? And what might you recommend that we learn over Shavuot to get ourselves inspired?
Okay, so three quick things. I am going to absolutely go along with Yaffa and say that, you know, even if for people who are not generally going to be on Zoom on Shavuot, I would say this might be the time to be learning with others on Zoom. That's the first thing I'm going to say. The second thing I'm going to say is, if you're not going to be doing that, then I love the idea of getting a group of friends together and dividing up some particular sefer or some particular, you know, group of thematic midrashim, and knowing that you're responsible for this particular chapter and this person's responsible for that chapter. And so even if you're by yourself, you're not, you know that you are all doing this together. I think that could be a really special and meaningful Shavuot experience. And in terms of a specific text, I love the idea of going back to places in Tanakh where the coming together of Jews in order to rededicate themselves to the Torah, or for the Torah to be read to them, besides Har Sinai. So for example, chapter 8 of the book of Nehemiah, where the people have come back to Israel, to Jerusalem after 70 years, and it's a time of, it's a really difficult time for them, right? Like, we are in this horrible time now. They were in a really difficult time, not easy situation, a not placid situation. And to look at that chapter of everyone gathering together in Jerusalem and the Torah being read to them and being explained to them, and the crying and the laughing and the eating, all of that can be very, I think, emotional and meaningful and fulfilling for us in a spiritual way this Shavuot.
Thank you. I love that. I'd like to now turn the Q&A over to you, the participants. If you can send our panelists some questions in this group chat, we would love to take some questions from you on the things that are burning questions, those that you are wondering as we are going into Shavuot, questions perhaps about that, whether it is more about learning, if it is about fulfilling holy relationships and getting yourself started for today as we go into our next step of being able to go into our breakout sessions. Please send us some questions. We will take a few, maybe 2 or 3, before we take a quick break before we go into our breakouts. As I give people some time to be able to send us the questions in our group chat, I would like to bring your attention back to our Yom Iyun schedule, where at 12:30 and at 2 o'clock Eastern time, so whichever time zone you are in, we are going to then be having 3 options at 12:30 and 3 options at 2 o'clock Eastern to be able to go into smaller, more intimate learning opportunities. So if you go to the schedule that you were sent, there, it is a dynamic PDF where you can click on the links to be able to access every Zoom to get to that schedule, to get to that class that you would like to go to. We are trying to mimic the idea of voting with your feet as we would have if we were together in person. So with that, we have a couple of questions that have come in. And this first one is from Beryl, and for our panelists, this is going to be a first come, first serve. So I'm going to ask the question, and if there is someone who has a burning answer, please jump in to be the first to answer. But technology exacerbates inequality. How do we build holy relationships while recognizing that we marginalize people with poor connections due to financial or geographic factors? So thinking about perhaps the ways in which now, instead of being able to gather in person, we have this technology, right? We have computers or we have internet access, and it might be disparate for others. How might we keep that in mind as we develop these holy relationships or develop opportunities for holy relationships? And Beryl, thank you for letting me pull a little more out of your question and taking that liberty. So if anybody on the panel wants to jump in on thinking about technology limitations and factors and being sensitive to those as we think about resources for holy relationships during this time.
Yeah, I would love to. The same way that birthright allowed thousands and thousands and thousands of young Jews to have, to get to come to Israel, and, money was allocated for that. There is money now being allocated for things, and I would love to say that I don't know exactly how this would work, but for those who do not have the best connection, do not have the best computer, they don't have the best internet, this is a time for every Jew to be able to be afforded that so that they can be learning and in community with others right now. Simple as that.
I'm going to add to this question because there was one that touches upon the same, where we've been very Zoom heavy, and there might be problems with Zoom, or we might be zoomed out. Might there be other thoughts on platforms that Pardes is going to be using? This could be a good time for a plug on the podcast to think about ways to continue to interact with the community virtually.
We're thinking about that a lot. We're developing additional platforms. Shani can tell us a little bit more about a kind of a daily dose of Pardes, an app that we're developing that enables various tracks and people to learn in chavruta, and it's kind of a learning challenge where we have a period of a month or 2 months of learning one particular book or one particular chapter or one particular topic, and you can do it either individually or you can do it with a chavruta. And I think, we're all thinking, Pardes and every other institution, about growing our online presence well beyond what it currently is. We have a platform, Elmad, which is our online portal it's mostly been audio podcasts, a little bit of downloaded study sources, study companions, a little bit of video, but we're planning on ratcheting that up and developing it and making it even more user-friendly and adding all kinds of content in the weeks ahead.
Thank you. We have another great question from Joey Heyman, that in the spirit of Machloket Matters, what have you learned from your own interactions speaking with others who hold a different opinion on what is, quote, appropriate these days? How do we engage in these conflicts constructively when the issues are this hot button? And this can be answered by anyone on this panel.
I'm going to jump in, if that's okay, because I had a really fun moment where I was learning in Tractate Shabbat the story, very famous story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai going into the cave, and this question of isolation. People have been using it a lot, I know, but what was interesting was I was learning it with dear friends and chavrutas, also Pardes alumni, and we understood when we come out of the cave, when Bar Yochai comes out of the cave, with his son, they're burning everything up as they look outside, right? And my chavruta partners were saying that that's somewhat what's going on when you walk out. I don't know if anyone else has this experience. When you walk out of your house and you see people who are not wearing masks, or they're not social distancing, or they're not, that you're just like filled with this rage. And it really sort of, I think it speaks to your question, Joey, about sort of how do we accept that people are going to make different choices than us, whether that means at a personal level, at a local level, at a state level, at a national level. In the States, it's a huge conversation, and it's really sort of bringing out fundamental differences in approaches to science, approaches to, capitalism, human life. It's an interesting, I'm saying this without taking any sides or positions, but it is interesting to notice how it's bringing out major questions, which I think, by the way, also speaks to this issue of people not having technology and privilege and class issues that are happening in America. So it's actually a really fascinating thing. And I would say that there's a reason why they had to go back into the cave, because they weren't able to react. They weren't able to be in society. And so, I don't want us to necessarily have to go back into our caves, not that I'm taking, again, any position on this, but what does it mean to be able to simultaneously hold your position and be very strong in it, and also accept that others have different positions than you? And in a time when we're so interdependent in many, many ways, I think there's a message here that's really important about trying to find common ground, trying to work together, and perhaps dialogue and understanding is more important now than ever. We have to see the Tzelem Elohim. We have to see the divine in the other right now, more than ever. Certainly here in the States, I would say.
Thank you. We only have a couple more minutes together before we transition and have a quick break before our next session together. So I'd love to give a chance for each panelist to give a quick closing thought as we are going into Shavuot and thinking about all the ways in which to connect to holy relationships. In particular, we spoke a lot about community and a lot about self, but a lot of Shavuot is really this commitment that we are making between ourselves, or ourselves as community, and the divine. And what advice would you give all of us as we go into a frame of mind in what might be a very vulnerable moment of embracing or thinking about this particular holy relationship with the divine? What courage or advice might you give us as we go into this holiday? What takeaway? So if I can, this time I'm going to start with Aviva.
Okay, there was a blip there for a second, so I wasn't sure if my name was called. I think it was, right? Okay. So I've been thinking a lot about the name of this Yom Iyun and the idea of holiness, and the difference between holiness and Kedusha. And holiness, the word holiness comes, or holy, comes from the Old English, which has to do with wholeness, hale, being hale and hearty and almost perfect. But Kedusha is nothing like that at all. And maybe to harken back to what Leon talked about early on, the very beginning of this discussion, the things that we do that are Kedoshim in our rituals and in our really in our practice, they're all things that we do together. right? We say Kedusha together during Tefillah. Kaddish is something that is done with other people, call and response. Even when you're doing Kiddush, even when I'm doing it alone by myself on a Friday night, I say it out loud because I feel like this is a group sort of thing going on. Kedusha is very different than holiness. We're not, in Judaism, we're not looking for perfection. Kedusha is messy. And so it's not always perfect. There's always going to be somebody else there for it to be a kadosh moment. And so I guess my blessing, my advice to everyone is it's all good. It's all okay, because it's supposed to be messy. It's not supposed to be perfect and set alone. It's not about the aloneness. It's about the together. That's what Kedusha is.
Thank you. Rav Meir.
I love that. I love that, and I just want to offer a brief counterpoint. I think that there's one of the gifts of this period was to cultivate a sensitivity to the loneliness that all of us experience sometimes, and many people experience much of the time. And I think that there's a kind of communal loneliness that we experience, right? The Jewish people is called Am Levadad Yishkon, a people that dwells apart, a people that's lonely. And maybe one of the gifts of this period is to be more sensitive to friends and relatives, particularly to older people, to cultivate a greater empathy for the need for connection in ways that might inspire us to do more acts of kindness that assuage the loneliness that's all around us.
Thank you.
I would pick up on that, and I would just say that, I disagree but this is Pardes, with what Aviva said. I think that holiness certainly does have to do with us aspiring for perfection, for transcendence. And I think that, on the contrary, in a situation where people are by themselves, I think it affords people the opportunity for self-reflection and to really think about how can I become a better person. And I think, especially in terms of what Leon brought up, in terms of, this ability to empathize with the people around me and to realize we're all in the same situation. And even in terms of what you brought up, Eliana, in terms of our responsibility, right, our religious responsibility, but beyond that, just the fact that, in other words, that here we now, right, have time to reflect on who we are, how can we become better people? How can we now take that? I think especially in the realm of, of disagreements. Okay, I'll just say one thing. When I went, when I originally went out during the time of the, and there was a whole issue about minyanim, the outdoor minyanim, and certain things got me very, very angry. And yet at the same time, when I went out a few weeks later, I said, boy, this is amazing how much people really want to be able to daven in a minyan and take this seriously. And so I think it's a question of perspective. How do we look at what's going on, and how much is it that we tend to look at it in a very negative way, or how much are we able to somehow take it and flip it and actually take it in a very positive direction? So to me, that's my suggestion to everybody. We have a tendency very often with getting caught up with the problematics. I said to people when this first began, my parents were Holocaust survivors. And so when I look at what we're going through, and I think about what my mother went through when she was hiding in the woods, right, in the cold of Poland, without anything that she could possibly eat. This is, isolation deluxe. And I think that maybe it's something that we have to always put in perspective, and to think about how fortunate we are with all the means we have at our disposal, and how do we now take those means and then take it to a whole other level. So that's my suggestion. Let's try to use this as an opportunity to focus on the positive.
Thank you, Rav Meir. And Acharon Chaviv, Rav Yaffa, you are our last thought.
I don't really want to add anything to Rav Meir, because I agree with everything he said, and I wouldn't want to disagree with him ever. And I will say that for some people, it does feel very painful right now. even though I agree with you, I like that isolation deluxe. That's a great, it's a great way to put it. I'm gonna think about it that way. And there's also real pain. I wanna hold both things, that really we are, many of us are very privileged in this moment. And also many of us are in deep pain, and we're having different kinds of grief. There's lots of losses right now, and there's lots of grief, and there's lots of beauty, and all of those things are true, and the experience of it is true for many of us, that we have to hold both of those things. And just to echo everything that's been said, for me, my advice is don't let the cynicism win. It's not that there's not pain, but what there isn't room for is cynicism and disregard of others, and even sort of, there's just not room for cynicism right now. So I just want to invite us all to bring in love and compassion and acceptance and understanding wherever we can for others, and deeply, deeply for ourselves. This is a time of self-compassion, and really, because from there we'll be able to have compassion for others and bring it outside of our own isolation. So be kind to yourselves, give yourselves a lot of love, and give each other a lot of love.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our Rebbeim on this panel for kicking off our day of learning together with such power and insight. And I am going to turn this over so that we can move on to our next classes of the day. I'm going to turn it over to Rav Shani.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists again. Thank you to everyone here who has signed in to participate. I think, like Yaffa said, it really seems like thinking about holy relationships in this time is about being able to hold on to the reality of the challenge we're facing, while also being able to hold on to the opportunity of finding new ways during this moment of fostering those holy relationships with those that we cherish, and really holding on to both those feelings of loss and hope for what we might be able to accomplish and learn,